In the heart of downtown Atlanta, the courthouse rose like a monument to order and fairness, its towering marble pillars and intricate stonework gleaming under the midday sun. The building exuded an air of timeless dignity, a silent promise that justice would prevail within its walls. Yet for many who passed through its heavy oak doors, the echoing corridors whispered something else about dread, and the faint hum of power wielded unevenly. On this particular morning, the air inside courtroom 3C crackled with a tension so thick, it seemed to cling to the polished wooden benches and seep into the shafts of sunlight, pouring through the towering windows. Long shadows stretched across the floor, as if the room itself were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. At the plaintiff's table sat Tyrell Jenkins, a young man barely into his 20s, his dark suit slightly too large for his slender frame. His fingers twisted anxiously at the hem of his jacket, betraying the nerves that churned inside him. He kept his eyes down, tracing the grain of the wood in front of him, as though he could will himself invisible. Beside him, his mother, Lorraine, was a pillar of quiet strength. Her weathered hands rested gently on his arm, her touch a lifeline in the chaos of the moment. But her face told a different story, her lips pressed tight, her eyes burning with a fury she barely contained as they fixed on the woman across the room. Lorraine had spent sleepless nights replaying the incident in her mind, her son's trembling voice echoing in her ears, and now she sat here, a mother-turned-warrior, ready to see this through. Across the aisle, Officer Rebecca Langley lounged in her chair with the casual arrogance of someone who believed the world bent to her will. Her platinum blonde hair was scraped back into a severe bun, not a strand out of place, and her piercing blue eyes roamed the room with a mixture of boredom and disdain. She leaned back, arms crossed over her crisp uniform, her lips curling into a smirk that dared anyone to challenge her. Every so often, she'd tilt her head toward her lawyer, a slick man in an expensive suit, and mutter something under her breath, her words sharp enough to draw a stifled laugh from him. It was a performance, a calculated display of confidence meant to unsettle the room, and it worked. The gallery, a restless mix of Tyrell's family, local activists, curious spectators, and a handful of off-duty cops with badges glinting faintly under their jackets, shifted uncomfortably, their murmurs rising like a swarm of restless bees. High above them all, behind the imposing mahogany bench, sat Judge Cassandra Blake. In her early 40s, she carried herself with a quiet grace that belied the steel beneath. Her deep brown skin seemed to catch the light, giving her an almost ethereal glow, and her sharp eyes, dark and unyielding, swept the room with the precision of a hawk. Her natural curls were pulled back neatly, framing a face that radiated authority. Her chin tilted just enough to signal she was in command. The black robe draped over her shoulders flowed like a mantle of responsibility, pristine and unrumpled, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding below. Cassandra's hands rested lightly on her desk, fingers brushing the edges of her notes as she reviewed them, but inside, her pulse quickened. She could feel the electric charge in the air, the unspoken stakes of this trial. This wasn't just another case, it was a collision of wills, a test of whether justice could cut through the tangled web of power and privilege. The bailiff's voice sliced through the hum of the crowd like a blade. "Order in the court." He barked, and the chatter faded into an uneasy hush. Cassandra lifted her gavel, the smooth wood cool against her palm, and brought it down with a single, resonant tap. The sound reverberated, a call to attention that settled the room. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady and rich, carrying the weight of years spent honing her craft. "The case of Tyrell Jenkins versus Officer Rebecca Langley will now be called to order." Her gaze moved across the courtroom, taking in the faces before Herter's nervous fidgeting, Lorraine's steely resolve, Rebecca's brazen indifference. She let her words hang for a moment, grounding the proceedings in her unshakable presence. But Rebecca couldn't resist. As Cassandra outlined the day's agenda, the officer leaned toward her lawyer again, her voice low but deliberately audible to those nearby. "Can you believe this? I have to sit here and listen to this nonsense?" The words slithered through the air, sharp and venomous, landing like a slap. Lorraine stiffened, her breath catching as her nails dug into the armrest. Tyrell's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and anger. Even Rebecca's lawyer shot her a quick, warning glance, his jaw tightening as he sensed the ripples she'd caused. But Rebecca didn't flinch. She leaned back further, her smirk widening as if she'd just won some private game. Cassandra paused mid-sentence, her pen freezing above the page. The room seemed to contract, the air growing heavy with the weight of Rebecca's insolence. She felt a flicker of heat in her chest, a spark of indignation she quickly tamped down. She'd faced this before defendants, who saw her as a curiosity, an interloper on their turf, rather than the arbiter of their fate. Slowly, she raised her eyes to meet Rebecca's, her expression a mask of calm. "Officer Langley," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, sharp but controlled. "This is a court of law, not a stage for your personal commentary. I suggest you adjust your behavior accordingly." Rebecca tilted her head, her smile stretching into something almost feral. "Yes, Your Honor," she drawled, each syllable dripping with mockery. A murmur of unease rolled through the gallery, heads turning as spectators exchanged glances. Cassandra held her gaze for a heartbeat longer, her dark eyes boring into the officer's defiance, then returned to her notes. She wouldn't take the bait, not yet. Her role was to steer this ship, to keep the proceedings from veering into chaos, and she'd be damned if Rebecca Langley's antics derailed her. The prosecutor, Dana Mitchell, rose from her seat, smoothing the lines of her tailored blazer with a practiced hand. A woman in her late 30s with a no-nonsense demeanor. Dana carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd fought too many battles to count. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, "before we begin, the plaintiff would like to enter additional video evidence into the record." Cassandra nodded. A single, deliberate motion. "Proceed." As Dana handed a flash drive to the bailiff, Rebecca muttered again, loud enough for the front rows to catch. "More evidence," as if one video wasn't enough to waste everyone's time. The words hung there, brazen and unapologetic. Lorraine's hands clenched into fists, her knuckles whitening. While Tyrell shrank deeper into his seat, Cassandra set her pen down with a soft click, leaning forward just enough to command the room. "Officer Langley," she said, her tone now icy, "this is your second warning. Disrespecting this court will not be tolerated. The next time you speak out of turn, you will be held in contempt. Is that understood?" Rebecca's smirk flickered, a crack in her armor, but she recovered quickly. "Understood." She replied, her voice clipped and tight. "Good," Cassandra said, her words a wall of finality. "Miss Mitchell, you may proceed." The courtroom lights dimmed as the bailiff slotted the drive into the system, and a hush fell over the gallery. Dana stepped to the side, her face somber. "Your Honor, the footage you're about to see was recorded by the plaintiff's phone during the incident in question. It provides critical context to this case." The screen flared to life, and every eye turned toward it. The video was shaky, the frame jerking with Tyrell's unsteady grip, but the scene was unmistakable. There was Rebecca, her uniform stark against the evening light, dragging Tyrell from his car with a force that made the onlookers flinch. "Get out of the car," she snapped, her voice a whipcrack of authority laced with contempt. She yanked his arm harder as he stumbled, struggling to keep his balance. "I don't have all day to deal with people like you." Cassandra's jaw tightened as she watched, her fingers pressing into the edge of her desk. On the screen, Rebecca shoved Tyrell against the hood of his car, her hands rough and unrelenting. "Why are you doing this?" Tyrell's voice broke through the static, raw with fear and confusion. "I didn't do anything." Rebecca's response was a cold, cutting sneer. "Maybe you didn't. Or maybe you just haven't been caught yet." The video ended abruptly, the screen plunging into black, and a stunned silence swallowed the room. Rebecca shifted in her seat, her posture still rigid, but the smugness had drained from her face. Her fingers tapped a restless rhythm against the table, a nervous tic she couldn't suppress. Lorraine's eyes glistened with unshed tears, her breath ragged as she squeezed Tyrell's hand. The gallery sat frozen, the weight of what they'd seen sinking in. Cassandra let the silence stretch, her face impassive, but her mind racing. This was more than a single act of brutality. It was a window into a system rotten with arrogance, a pattern of abuse laid bare. And as she sat there, the gavel still in her grasp, she knew this was only the beginning. Justice, she thought, was a blade that cut deepest when wielded with precision, and she intended to wield it well. The lesson here was stark and unforgiving. Power, when abused, carried consequences that rippled far beyond the moment. Rebecca had walked into this room believing her badge was a shield, but Cassandra saw it for what it was, a tool that could be turned against its wielder. When the truth came to light, the courtroom, once a stage for Rebecca's bravado, was now a crucible where justice would burn away the lies, leaving only the raw, unvarnished truth in its wake. In the dimly lit courtroom, the young prosecutor, Dana Mitchell, stood with a presence that belied her small stature. Her voice rang out with a quiet but unshakable conviction as she addressed the judge. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, her tone steady and resolute. "The video you've just viewed was recorded by Mr. Tyrell Jenkins during what should have been a routine traffic stop." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. Officer Rebecca Langley claimed she pulled him over because of a broken tail light. However, a thorough inspection of Mr. Jenkins' vehicle later revealed no such damage existed. Dana's eyes flicked briefly toward the jury, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, before shifting to the gallery where hushed whispers buzzed like static in the air. "What's more, Your Honor," she continued, her voice rising slightly, "the plaintiff will testify that after the video cut off, Officer Langley detained him without any justifiable reason, conducted an illegal search of his car, and resorted to excessive force when he dared to question her actions verbally, not physically." The gallery erupted into a low murmur, the words typical and disgrace floating just loud enough to be heard, adding fuel to the already tense atmosphere. The bailiff's voice sliced through the noise, sharper this time, as he bellowed, "Order in the court." His command reverberated off the wood-paneled walls, and the room fell into an uneasy silence. Judge Cassandra Blake, seated high on the bench, waited patiently, her piercing gaze locked onto Dana. Her expression remained impassive, but the subtle twitch of her pen against her notepad betrayed her keen attention. "Does the defense have a response at this time?" she asked, her voice calm yet carrying an edge of authority that demanded an answer. Martin Graves, the defense attorney, rose slowly from his seat, a balding man in his late 50s. He carried himself with an air of calculated deliberation. His fingers tugged at his tie, adjusting it with exaggerated care as if the extra seconds might gift him a stronger argument. "Your Honor," he began, his voice dripping with a politeness that felt rehearsed, "while the prosecution's video evidence is undeniably striking, it fails to provide the full scope of what transpired that night." He paused for effect, glancing toward Officer Langley, who sat stiffly at the defense table, her lips curling into a faint smirk as he spoke. Officer Langley acted well within her discretion as a law enforcement officer. Martin continued, his tone growing smoother, more confident. She took necessary steps to ensure her safety during what she reasonably perceived as a potentially volatile encounter. Rebecca nodded subtly, leaning back in her chair with an air of smug satisfaction. Her muttered "that's right" barely audible but brimming with defiance. Martin pressed on, his voice steadying as he found his rhythm. "Furthermore, we contend that the plaintiff's video begins at a moment carefully chosen to cast my client in the harshest possible light, conveniently omitting the context of her initial exchange with Mr. Jenkins." Judge Cassandra's face remained a mask of neutrality, but her pen scratched a deliberate note, a small movement that Dana caught from the corner of her eye. "Mr. Graves," Cassandra interjected, her tone measured but firm, "are you implying that the video evidence has been altered or manipulated?" Martin faltered for a split second, his mouth parting as if to respond before he caught himself. "No, Your Honor," he said carefully. "I'm simply suggesting that it captures only a fragment of the encounter, leaving out critical details." Cassandra's eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her nod sharp and deliberate. "I see," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "In that case, I trust you'll present evidence to substantiate your claims about this so-called context and discretion." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as Martin hesitated, his confidence wavering. His lips parted again, but no sound emerged. Cassandra leaned forward, her silence a challenge in itself, and when no rebuttal came, she straightened, "Very well," she said coolly. "We will proceed." Dana turned to call her first witness, her heart pounding with a mix of determination and nervous anticipation. "The prosecution calls Tyrell Jenkins to the stand," she announced, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling within her. Tyrell, a young man with a lanky frame and tired eyes, approached the witness stand with palpable reluctance. His hands trembled as they gripped the polished wooden railing, the faint creak of his fingers tightening against it echoing in the stillness. In the front row of the gallery, his mother sat rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met his, and she offered a small, encouraging nod. Tyrell took a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling unevenly as he raised his right hand to take the oath. "I swear to tell the truth," he said, his voice cracking like dry timber under the weight of the moment. Dana stepped forward, her demeanor softening as she met his gaze. "Mr. Jenkins," she began, her tone warm and laced with empathy, "thank you for being here today. I know this isn't easy. Can you tell us, in your own words, what happened on the evening of the incident?" Tyrell's eyes darted toward Rebecca, who sat rigid at the defense table, her icy stare boring into him. He quickly looked away, his shoulders hunching as if to shield himself from her presence. "I was driving home from work," he started, his voice barely above a whisper, fragile and raw. "It was latterly late. My shift at the warehouse had run long, and I was exhausted. I was just a block from my house when I saw the flashing lights in my rearview mirror." Dana nodded gently, urging him to go on. "And what happened next?" she asked, her voice a lifeline in the suffocating tension of the room. Tyrell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing as he fought to steady himself. "I pulled over, like you're supposed to," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Rebecca without looking at her, as if saying her name might summon something he couldn't face. "She came up to my window and asked for my license and registration. I handed them over. He didn't know what I'd done wrong." His fingers tightened around the edge of the witness stand, knuckles whitening. "Did Officer Langley explain why she stopped you?" Dana pressed gently. Tyrell hesitated, his brow furrowing as he replayed the memory. "She said my tail light was out," he murmured. "But it wasn't. I checked it myself the next morning. It was fine." Dana's expression darkened, a flicker of indignation crossing her features. "What happened after that?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent. Tyrell's gaze dropped to his hands, his voice growing quieter. Almost lost in the vastness of the courtroom, "She told me to get out of the car. I asked why. I didn't understand, but she just started yelling. She said if I didn't get out, she'd drag me out herself." The room fell deathly silent, save for the faint scratch of Cassandra's pen against her notepad. Tyrell's mother pressed a crumpled tissue to her eyes, her face etched with a mixture of grief and fury as she listened to her son's trembling words. "Did you comply?" Dana asked, her tone gentle but unwavering. Tyrell nodded, his movements slow and deliberate. "I did," he said, "but when I stepped out, she grabbed my arm hard. It hurt, and I told her I wasn't resisting, but she didn't care. She slammed me against the side of my car." A faint gasp rippled through the gallery, a wave of shock and sympathy that seemed to crash against Rebecca's stoic facade. Her smirk had vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped grimace. Her fingers drummed faster against the table, a nervous tick that betrayed the unraveling of her once ironclad confidence. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Dana said, her voice thick with gratitude and resolve. "I know this is difficult, but your testimony matters more than you know." As Tyrell stepped down, his legs unsteady beneath him, Cassandra's voice rose above the hum of the courtroom. "This case is not merely about a single traffic stop," she declared, her words heavy with purpose. "It's about the standards we demand from those entrusted with the law's power. I expect everyone here to proceed with the utmost respect for this court and for the truth." Her gaze lingered on Rebecca, a subtle narrowing of her eyes delivering a silent warning. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, and for the first time, Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the cracks in her arrogance splintering wider. The courtroom settled into an uneasy stillness as Tyrell retreated to his mother's side, her arms wrapping around him in a protective embrace. His testimony hung in the air like a thunder cloud, its weight pressing down on every soul present. Even Rebecca, who had seemed untouchable mere moments ago, now appeared diminished. Her fingers tapped a restless rhythm on the table, a faint echo of the bravado she could no longer fully muster. Above them all, Judge Cassandra Blake sat like a sentinel, the soft sunlight streaming through the tall windows casting long shadows across her bench. Beneath her composed exterior, a fire burned deep, unyielding commitment to justice in a world where it so often slipped through the cracks. The defense was next. Martin Graves stood once more, adjusting his glasses with a deliberate slowness that bordered on theatrical. "Your Honor," he said, his voice smooth and polished. "The defense calls Officer Rebecca Langley to the stand." The gallery shifted, a ripple of anticipation coursing through the crowd. Rebecca rose, her movements stiff but purposeful, smoothing the front of her uniform as she strode toward the witness stand. Her jaw was set, her earlier smirk replaced by a mask of steely resolve. Yet as she raised her hand to take the oath, a flicker of uncertainty danced across her face. Fear, perhaps, or the dawning realization that the consequences of her actions were closing in. She sat, her posture rigid, as Martin approached with a smile that oozed false warmth. "Officer Langley," he began, his tone almost paternal, "thank you for taking the stand. Let's start with the basics. Can you tell the court about your experience in law enforcement?" Rebecca straightened, her shoulders squaring as she prepared to defend herself. But beneath the surface, the storm was brewing louder, and the lessons of justice off accountability and the perils of unchecked power were rising to meet her head-on. The weight of her badge had always been a source of pride for Rebecca Langley, a shield she wore with unwavering resolve during her 8 years with the Atlanta Police Department. Sitting in the witness chair, her voice rang out steady and deliberate, as though she'd practiced the words 1,000 times in front of a mirror. "I've been an officer for nearly a decade," she declared, her posture rigid, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "In that time, I've managed countless traffic stops, made arrests, conducted investigations of them. Every step I've taken has been guided by protocol, every decision rooted in my duty to protect the community." Her eyes flicked briefly to Martin Graves, her attorney, who sat at the defense table. His nod was subtle, a quiet signal of approval that seemed to bolster her confidence. Martin leaned forward slightly, his expression calm yet encouraging. "And on the night in question," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "you were conducting a routine traffic stop, correct?" Rebecca straightened even further, her chin lifting as she replied, "Yes, I spotted a car with a broken tail light weaving slightly on the road. It's standard procedure to pull a vehicle over for something like that." Her tone grew firmer, as if the repetition of the facts could cement her story into an unshakable truth. "Did you, at any moment, feel that the situation might turn dangerous?" Martin asked, his words carefully chosen, leading her gently down the path he'd laid out. Rebecca paused, just for a heartbeat, her gaze drifting to the courtroom ceiling as though searching for the right answer. "Yes," she said at last, her voice hardening with conviction. "When I approached the driver's side window, the manmer, Jenkins seemed restless, unsettled. His hands were moving, fidgeting with something I couldn't quite make out. I couldn't see them clearly, and that's a red flag for any officer. For my own safety, I asked him to step out of the vehicle." Martin tilted his head, pressing further. "And did he comply with your request?" Rebecca's lips tightened, a flicker of frustration crossing her face. "Not right away," she admitted, her tone sharpening like a blade honed by memory. "He questioned my authority, my right to give him an order." He hesitated, dragging his feet before finally getting out. "I had to raise my voice, be firm, to keep things under control." In the gallery, a woman, Tyrell Jenkins, his mother, shifted in her seat, her hands twisting a crumpled tissue as her face contorted with a mixture of grief and fury. Her eyes bore into Rebecca, but the officer didn't flinch, her focus locked on Martin. "So," Martin continued, his voice a steady anchor in the tense room, "you acted within the bounds of your training to maintain order. Would you say that's a fair assessment?" Rebecca nodded, a faint lift to her chin signaling a resurgence of pride. "Yes, everything I did that night followed procedure. I stayed by the book." The air in the courtroom shifted as Dana Mitchell, the prosecutor, rose from her seat. Her movements were deliberate, each step toward the witness stand calculated. her heels clicking softly against the polished wood floor. She carried herself with a quiet intensity, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp as she glanced down at her notes. Before locking gazes with Rebecca, Officer Langley, Dana began, her tone polite yet edged with an unmistakable firmness. You said Mr. Jenkins appeared agitated when you approached his vehicle. Can you paint a clearer picture for us? What exactly did you see? Rebecca shifted in her chair, the faintest crack appearing in her composed facade. He was restless, she said, her hands gesturing vaguely as she searched for the right words. Moving around a lot in his seat. It looked like he was reaching for something I couldn't see. Dana's head tilted slightly, her voice pressing deeper. And what did you think he might have been reaching for? Rebecca hesitated, her fingers brushing the edge of the stand. I couldn't be certain, she admitted, her voice quieter now. That's why I told him to get out for my safety. Dana nodded, her face unreadable. I see. And yet, the video footage from your body camera shows Mr. Jenkins with both hands on the steering wheel as you approached his window. How do you account for that? Rebecca blinked, a flicker of unease rippling through her. Her breath caught for a split second before she answered. The video doesn't capture everything. There were moments before and after that it didn't record. Her words tumbled out faster, as if speed could patch the holes in her story. Dana's gaze sharpened, her posture unwavering. So you're saying the footage is incomplete? Yes. Rebecca shot back, her voice firm again, clinging to defiance. It doesn't tell the full story. Dana let the statement linger, the silence stretching taut across the room. Then she stepped closer, her tone cool and unrelenting. Officer Langley, if you felt threatened enough to order Mr. Jenkins out of his car, why didn't you call for backup? That's standard protocol too, isn't it? Rebecca's mouth opened, then snapped shut. Her fingers gripped the stand so tightly her knuckles whitened. I didn't think it was necessary, she said at last, her voice faltering under the weight of Dana's scrutiny. Dana raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. You felt threatened enough to pull him from his vehicle and use force, but not enough to radio for help. That strikes me as inconsistent, doesn't it? A spark of irritation flared in Rebecca's eyes, her jaw clenching as she fought to hold her ground. I made a judgment call in the moment, she said, her words clipped and defensive. Dana nodded slowly, her voice dropping to a chilling calm. One final question, Officer Langley. In the video, you're heard saying, people like you. What did you mean by that? The courtroom fell deathly silent. Rebecca's face paled, her carefully constructed mask slipping as her breath hitched. She started, her voice trembling at the edges. It didn't come out the way I meant it. Dana's eyes narrowed, her tone slicing through the stillness. Then how was it meant? Rebecca froze, her silence louder than any explanation she could muster. In the gallery, a low whistle pierced the air, quickly silenced by the bailiff's sharp command for order. Judge Cassandra Blake tapped her gavel once, the sound echoing like a gunshot. This cross-examination will resume tomorrow, she declared, her voice steady and authoritative. Court is adjourned until 9 a.m. As the room emptied, Rebecca remained rooted in the witness chair, her shoulders slumped, her once ironclad confidence now a fragile shell. Cassandra lingered at the bench, her dark eyes studying the officer with an unreadable intensity. The storm was brewing, and the cracks in Rebecca's story were widening just as, it seemed, was a weight far heavier than her badge. The next morning, courtroom 3C buzzed with restless energy. Word of the trial had spread like wildfire through Atlanta's streets, drawing a swelling crowd to the gallery. Activists whispered urgently among themselves, their signs tucked under seats. Community leaders sat with furrowed brows, their presence a silent demand for accountability, and reporters scribbled furiously, their pens racing to capture every detail. The air crackled with anticipation, the weight of unspoken questions pressing against the walls. Would Officer Langley hold her ground? Could justice prevail in a system so tangled with power? Judge Cassandra Blake swept into the room, her black robe trailing behind her like a shadow of authority. Her heels clicked softly against the floor as she ascended to the bench, her movements fluid yet commanding. She settled into her seat, adjusted the stack of papers before her, and let her piercing gaze sweep across the courtroom. This court is now in session, she announced, her voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. "We will resume the cross-examination of Officer Langley. Ms. Mitchell, you may proceed." Dana Mitchell rose from the prosecution table, her posture straight but relaxed, her face a mask of calm determination. She approached the stand with the same deliberate grace as the day before. Though her eyes burned with a quiet fire, she knew this moment could tip the scales. Rebecca sat waiting, her uniform crisp and her shoulders squared. But the tension in her frame betrayed her. Her eyes darted to Martin, who offered a faint nod, a lifeline she clung to despite the fraying edges of her defense. "Officer Langley," Dana began, her voice steady but laced with an edge of steel. "Yesterday we discussed your actions during the traffic stop with Mr. Jenkins. I'd like to revisit a few details to ensure absolute clarity for the court." Rebecca shifted, her fingers brushing the armrests of the chair. "Of course," she replied, her tone clipped, as though bracing herself for the onslaught. "You stated that you felt threatened during the stop," Dana continued, taking a small step closer. "Is that still your position?" Rebecca nodded, her voice firming up like a wall she was desperate to rebuild. "Yes," Dana pressed on, unrelenting. "You also said Mr. Jenkins seemed agitated, moving in a way that made you suspicious. But the video shows his hands clearly on the steering wheel when you approached. How do you explain that contradiction?" Rebecca's grip tightened, her nails digging into the wood. "The video doesn't show everything," she repeated, though the words sounded hollow now, a mantra losing its power. "There were moments it didn't catch." Dana nodded, as if she'd anticipated the dodge. "Let's focus on what it does show, then. You're heard saying, 'people like you.' Yesterday, you struggled to clarify that. Have you had time to reflect?" The question landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the room. Rebecca swallowed hard, her lips pressing into a thin, trembling line. "I misspoke," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was a bad choice of words." Dana tilted her head, her gaze piercing. "A bad choice of words? Tell me, Officer Langley, do you often stumble over your words during traffic stops, or was this a rare slip?" Rebecca's jaw clenched, her eyes flashing with defiance. "It was a what-I'm thing," she said through gritted teeth. Dana's expression remained calm, but her voice carried a quiet weight. "Interesting, because your personnel file shows multiple complaints incidents where your conduct raised questions. This wasn't just a slip, was it? It was a glimpse into something deeper." The gallery stirred, a murmur rippling through the crowd as Rebecca's facade crumbled further. In that moment, the trial became more than a dispute over a single night. It was a reckoning, a stark reminder that power, unchecked, could twist justice into a weapon. And as Dana stepped back, her eyes locked on Rebecca's, the lesson hung heavy in the air. Consequences would come, not just for one officer, but for a system that too often shielded the wrong hands. A wave of hushed murmurs rolled through the crowded gallery, a restless hum that snapped to silence as Judge Cassandra Blake's gavel struck the wood. With a crisp, commanding crack, Rebecca Langley, seated at the defense table, felt her carefully constructed mask of calm fracture under the weight of the moment. Her shoulders stiffened, and her breath hitched as she forced out a retort, her voice tight with defiance. "Those complaints were baseless," she snapped, her words sharp enough to cut through the thick air. "People just don't like it when someone holds them accountable, plain and simple." Her hazel eyes flicked toward the prosecutor, daring a challenge, though beneath her bravado, a flicker of unease gnawed at her. Dana Mitchell, standing tall and unyielding, arched a single eyebrow, her face a study in controlled skepticism. The faint lines around her mouth tightened as she absorbed Rebecca's words, her piercing gaze never wavering. "Baseless, you say," she replied, her tone cool but edged with a quiet intensity that made the room lean in. "So, every single person who dared to file a complaint against you." Every voice that spoke up was simply lying. Her question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged, daring Rebecca to dig herself deeper. Rebecca's face flushed a deep crimson, the heat rising to her cheeks as her pulse hammered in her ears. "I didn't say that," she shot back, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to steady it. She clenched her fists beneath the table, nails digging into her palms as she fought to regain control. The accusation stung, and she could feel the eyes of the jury boring into her. Their silent judgment a weight she couldn't shake. Dana stepped closer, her movements deliberate, her heels clicking softly against the polished courtroom floor. "But that's what you implied, Officer Langley," she pressed, her voice sharpening like a blade honed for precision. "Tell me, is it possible that your habit of escalating situations, your tendency to lean on excessive force, has painted you as someone who abuses the power entrusted to you?" Her words were measured, each one landing like a stone in still water, rippling outward to stir the room's tension. Rebecca's eyes narrowed into slits, her jaw tightening as she wrestled with the urge to lash out. The silence that followed Dana's question stretched on, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a noose. She wanted to fire back, to defend the choices she'd made in the heat of the moment, but the words wouldn't come. Her mind raced images of late-night patrols, split-second decisions, and the blurred line between duty and instinct flashing before her. She felt exposed, raw, as if the courtroom lights were peeling back her skin. From the bench, Judge Cassandra Blake leaned forward ever so slightly, her presence a quiet storm of authority that demanded attention without effort. Her dark eyes, framed by the stern lines of her face, locked onto Rebecca with an intensity that made the officer's stomach twist. "Officer Langley," she said, her voice slicing through the stillness like a shard of glass. "The prosecutor has posed a direct question. I expect an answer." The judge's tone was even, but beneath it lay an unmistakable steel, a reminder that no one in her courtroom could evade the truth for long. Rebecca's lips parted, her breath shallow as she struggled to form a response. The weight of Cassandra's stare pinned her in place, stripping away the last vestiges of her defiance. Her mind scrambled for an escape, but there was none. Finally, her voice emerged, barely a whisper, fragile and frayed. "I acted within my training," she said, the words tasting hollow even to her own ears. She dropped her gaze to the table, unable to meet the eyes that bore down on her. Knowing how weak her defense sounded in the face of mounting scrutiny, Dana's lips pressed into a thin, unsatisfied line, her frustration simmering just beneath her composed exterior. She took a measured step back, her posture rigid with purpose. "Let's move on," she said, her voice clipped as she turned to address the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution would like to submit additional evidence into the record." Her tone was formal, but there was a spark in her eyes, a hint of the fire she was about to unleash. Cassandra nodded, her expression unreadable as she gestured for the bailiff to approach. The young man, weary and nervous under the courtroom's scrutiny, hurried forward with a small stack of papers clutched in his hands. He handed them to the judge with a slight tremble, his eyes darting briefly to Rebecca before retreating. Cassandra's fingers moved deftly as she skimmed the documents, her brow furrowing faintly before she passed them to the defense table with a flick of her wrist. The rustle of paper was the only sound in the breathless room. Dana pivoted to face the jury, her voice steady and resonant as she held their attention. "These documents," she began, gesturing to the papers now resting before the defense, "are internal reports from the Atlanta Police Department. They chronicle Officer Langley's involvement in a series of troubling incidents cases, marked by questionable conduct, including the planting of evidence and the falsification of reports. This isn't a single misstep, ladies and gentlemen. This is a pattern that demands we ask, what happens when power is wielded without restraint?" Her words carried a quiet urgency, weaving a narrative that painted Rebecca not as a protector, but as a predator cloaked in a badge. The gallery erupted into a chorus of stifled whispers, the shock rippling through the onlookers like a current. Faces turned to one another, eyes wide with disbelief, while the jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging fleeting, uneasy glances. Rebecca felt the air leave her lungs, her composure shattering like brittle glass. Her hands, once steady, now trembled faintly on the table, and her face drained of color, leaving her looking small and fragile in a uniform that suddenly seemed too large for her shrinking frame. Cassandra's gavel tapped once, a sharp, authoritative sound that cut through the rising tide of murmurs. "Order," she commanded, her voice calm but carrying the weight of a thunderclap. The room stilled instantly, every eye turning to her as she fixed her gaze on Rebecca. "Officer Langley, these are grave allegations. Do you wish to respond?" Her tone was measured, but her eyes held a quiet storm. a promise that justice would not bend under excuses. Rebecca's head dipped, her shoulders slumping as her voice emerged in a threadbare whisper. "I was following orders," she said, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The admission hung in the air, fragile and damning, and the room fell into a stunned hush. Even the bailiff froze mid-step, his wide eyes darting between the officer and the prosecutor. Dana seized the opening, stepping closer to the stand with a predator's grace. "Following orders?" she echoed, her voice rising with incredulity. "Are you suggesting, Officer Langley, that your superiors instructed you to engage in misconducto plant evidence, to lie on reports?" Her questions were a trap, and Rebecca felt the jaws closing around her. She hesitated, her mind reeling as she realized the corner she'd painted herself into. "No," she stammered, backtracking desperately. "That's not what I meant." "But that's what you said," Dana cut in, her tone unrelenting. "So which is it? Were you a puppet following orders, or did you act on your own flawed judgment?" She paused, letting the silence press down on Rebecca like a physical weight, her eyes boring into the officer with a mixture of pity and resolve. Rebecca had no answer. Her mouth opened, then closed, her silence louder than any defense she could muster. As the court adjourned for the day, Cassandra watched her from the bench, her sharp gaze unwavering. The officer who had once strode into the courtroom with an air of untouchable arrogance now sat diminished, her bravado stripped away layer by layer. Cassandra's lips pressed into a thin line as she rose, her robes rustling softly. She knew the hardest revelations were still ahead, but the cracks in Rebecca's armor were widening, and just as slow, deliberate, and unyielding was taking root. The lesson was clear: power unchecked breeds corruption, and no badge could shield someone from the consequences of their own actions. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the sun spilling through the towering courthouse windows to cast long, jagged shadows across the gleaming floors. By the time court reconvened, the room buzzed with an electric tension, the gallery packed to bursting with spectators craning for a glimpse of the unfolding drama. The case had gripped Atlanta like a fever, its stakes climbing higher with every damning revelation. Every seat was claimed, and outside, a restless line of onlookers stretched down the steps, their murmurs rising like a distant tide. Cassandra swept into the courtroom at precisely 9 a.m., her black robes billowing slightly as she took her place at the bench. The chatter died instantly, swallowed by the force of her presence. Her eyes swept the room, lingering for a moment on Rebecca, whose posture had crumbled further overnight. The officer's shoulders hunched forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles gleamed white against the dark wood of the table. If she harbored any lingering hope, it was buried deep beneath a growing avalanche of dread. With a single, deliberate tap of her gavel, Cassandra called the room to order. "This court is now in session," she announced, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of anticipation. The sound reverberated, grounding the restless energy that crackled through the air. Dana rose first, her movements smooth and purposeful, a single folder tucked under her arm. Her heels clicked rhythmically as she approached the bench, her face a mask of quiet determination. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and unwavering, "the prosecution would like to call its next witness Sergeant Michael Carter." The name dropped like a stone into the room, sending a fresh wave of murmurs cascading through the gallery. Sergeant Michael Carter was no stranger to the Atlanta Police Department, a towering figure with broad shoulders and a neatly pressed uniform. He carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who had weathered years of scrutiny and emerged unbowed. His reputation as a straight shooter and officer of unshakable integrity preceded him, and his presence in the trial sent a jolt of unease through Rebecca. Her eyes widened, her breath catching as he strode to the witness stand, his dark gaze brushing hers for a fleeting moment before settling on Dana. Carter took the oath with a steady hand, his deep voice resonating as he swore to tell the truth. Dana stepped forward, her posture firm but respectful. "Sergeant Carter, thank you for joining us today," she said, her tone warm yet professional. "Could you please state your position within the Atlanta Police Department for the court?" Carter nodded, his jaw set. "I'm a sergeant with the Internal Affairs Division," he replied, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of resolve. "I've served with the department for over 15 years, and as part of your role in internal affairs, Dana continued. Do you oversee investigations into officer misconduct? Yes, Carter said, his hands resting lightly on the edge of the stand. It's my responsibility to ensure officers follow departmental policies and to investigate any allegations of wrongdoing thoroughly. Dana's expression remained steady, but her voice took on a sharper edge. Sergeant Carter, are you familiar with Officer Rebecca Langley? Carter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of tension crossing his weathered face. Yes, I am, he answered, his tone clipped but firm. In what capacity? Dana pressed, her eyes narrowing slightly as she zeroed in. Carter leaned forward, his broad frame filling the stand. I've been involved in multiple internal investigations concerning Officer Langley's conduct, he said, his words measured but heavy with implication. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, and Rebecca's attorney, Martin Graves, shifted in his seat, his thin frame tensing as he scribbled a hurried note. Rebecca herself seemed to shrink, her face paling as the ground beneath her eroded further. Dana's voice cut through the rising tension, precise and unrelenting. Can you elaborate on the nature of these investigations, Sergeant Carter? Carter's hands tightened briefly on the stand, his dark eyes steady as he spoke. Over the past 3 years, there have been several complaints filed against Officer Langley, he explained. These include allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and falsification of reports. In each instance, there was enough evidence to justify further investigation. His voice was even, but the weight of his words landed like blows, each one stripping away another layer of Rebecca's crumbling facade. And what were the outcomes of these investigations? Dana asked, her tone neutral but her intent razor-sharp. Carter exhaled softly, a faint shadow of frustration crossing his face. Most of the cases were dismissed, he said. Either witnesses refused to cooperate, or there wasn't enough concrete evidence to proceed. However, in several instances, I recommended disciplinary action recommendants that were either watered down or outright ignored by higher-ranking officials. His words hung in the air, their implications sinking into the room like ink into water. The gallery buzzed again, a low hum of disbelief and outrage. Cassandra tapped her gavel twice, the sound crisp and final, restoring order with surgical precision. Dana pressed forward, her voice rising with a controlled intensity. Sergeant Carter, in your professional opinion, were these decisions to dismiss or reduce disciplinary actions justified? Carter hesitated, his gaze steady, but his silence speaking volumes. After a beat, he straightened, his voice firm. No, he said. In my view, the department's handling of these cases showed a clear pattern of shielding certain officers, sacrificing accountability for the sake of protecting their own. The room seemed to hold its breath. Rebecca's hands shook visibly now, her nails digging into her palms as she avoided Carter's gaze. Martin Graves leaned toward her, his whisper urgent and strained, but she barely registered his words. Her world was collapsing, and the weight of Carter's testimony pressed down on her like a physical force. Dana stepped back, her eyes glinting with quiet triumph as she turned to the jury. No further questions, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady, but laced with the promise of more to come. The lesson was stark and inescapable. Power, when abused, left a trail of wreckage, and justice, though patient, would not be denied. As the courtroom buzzed with the echoes of Carter's words, Rebecca sat alone in her unraveling reality, the consequences of her actions closing in with every tick of the clock. Dana Mitchell edged closer to the witness stand, her heart pounding with a fierce determination that pulsed through every word she spoke. Her voice, already sharp with conviction, grew louder, more commanding, as she fixed her gaze on Sergeant Michael Carter. Sergeant, she began, her tone slicing through the thick courtroom air. Have you personally reviewed the body camera footage from the night Mr. Jenkins was arrested? Carter, a man weathered by years of navigating the murky waters of law enforcement, straightened in his seat, his jaw tightened as he nodded, his voice steady but laced with a quiet unease. Yes, I have, he replied. The footage is undeniably off. Officer Langley didn't just cross a line, she obliterated it. Excessive force, racially charged remarks, it's all there, plain as day. It's not just a breach of protocol. It's a betrayal of everything the department claims to stand for. The room seemed to hold its breath as Dana let Carter's words settle, their weight sinking into the minds of everyone present like stones dropping into still water. She didn't rush her next question. Instead, she allowed the silence to stretch, amplifying the tension until it was almost unbearable. "And tell me, Sergeant," she continued, her voice now a low simmer of controlled fury, "what did Internal Affairs do once they had this evidence in hand?" Carter shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flickering toward the defense table where Officer Rebecca Langley sat. "We pushed for immediate action," he said, his tone firm but tinged with frustration. "Suspension without delay, a full external investigation into Langley's conduct works. But the brass at the top, they shut it down, overruled us like it was nothing." At that moment, a gasp cut through the stillness. Rebecca, who had been sitting rigid and silent, snapped her head up, her face a storm of disbelief and rage. For the first time since the trial began, she couldn't hold back. "That's a lie," she shouted, leaping to her feet with such force that her chair scraped loudly against the polished floor. Her voice cracked with desperation, her eyes wild as years of pent-up entitlement clashed with the reality unfolding before her. The courtroom erupted into chaos. A wave of murmurs crashing through the gallery until Judge Cassandra Blake's gavel came down like a thunderclap. "Officer Langley," she barked, her voice a blade of authority that sliced through the disorder. "Sit down. You are out of order." Rebecca froze mid-motion, her chest heaving, her outburst reverberating in the sudden silence. Slowly, reluctantly, she sank back into her seat, her cheeks flushed a deep crimson, her hands trembling with a mix of fury and dread. Cassandra's piercing gaze lingered on her, a silent warning, before she turned back to Dana. "Miss Mitchell," she said, her voice now calm but unyielding, "you may proceed." Dana didn't hesitate. She squared her shoulders, her mind racing with the gravity of what was at stake not just for Tyrell Jenkins, but for the very idea of justice itself. "Sergeant Carter," she pressed, her words deliberate and cutting, "in your years of experience, would you say Officer Langley's actions that night were a one-off mistake, or part of something bigger, something uglier?" Carter didn't flinch. "It's not even a question," he said, his voice heavy with the weariness of someone who'd seen too much. "What she did aligns with a string of complaints we've had about her over the years: excessive force, bias, arrogance. This wasn't a slip-up. It's a pattern, a rotting thread woven deep into the fabric of how she operates." The courtroom buzzed with electricity, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Cassandra leaned forward slightly, her sharp eyes locking onto Rebecca, who seemed to shrink under the weight of that stare. "Officer Langley," the judge said, her voice low and deliberate, "do you have anything to say to Sergeant Carter's testimony?" Rebecca's lips parted, but no sound came. Her usual bravado had deserted her, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. She cast a desperate glance at her attorney, Martin Graves, who gave a subtle shake of his head, silently pleading with her to stay quiet, knowing anything she said now would only tighten the noose. "Very well," Cassandra said, leaning back with a quiet authority. "We'll take a 30-minute recess before closing statements." Her gavel tapped once, and she rose, her black robe billowing slightly as she exited the bench. The gallery erupted into a flurry of hushed whispers as soon as she was gone. Rebecca remained rooted to her chair, her face drained of color, her knuckles white as she gripped the table's edge. She felt the walls closing in at just the physical ones of the courtroom, but the invisible ones of consequence, of justice finally catching up to her. For years, she'd wielded her badge like a shield, convinced it made her untouchable. Now, that illusion was crumbling, and the fear gnawing at her gut was unlike anything she'd ever known. When the court reconvened, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The gallery hummed with restless energy, the sting of Carter's testimony still hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. Every pair of eyes tracked Rebecca, whose once steely confidence had eroded into a fragile shell. She sat hunched at the defense table, her shoulders slumped, her hands clasped so tightly her fingernails dug into her skin. Cassandra took her place at the bench, her gaze sweeping the room with the precision of a hawk before settling briefly on Rebecca. There was no sympathy there, only the cold impartiality of someone who understood that justice, though slow, was relentless. She tapped her gavel once, the sound crisp and commanding. "We'll now hear closing statements," she announced, her voice carrying a weight that made the room sit up straighter. "Miss Mitchell, you may begin." Dana rose with a grace that belied the fire burning within her. She walked toward the jury box, her steps measured, her presence filling the space. She paused, letting the silence build, her eyes meeting each juror's in turn before she spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and resonant, "what you've witnessed in this courtroom isn't just about one night, one arrest, one man. It's about a system that's allowed power to fester unchecked, to twist into something cruel and unjust. Officer Langley didn't stop Tyrell Jenkins that night to protect anyone. She stopped him because of who he was, a young black man driving home after a long shift, daring to exist in a world she thought she controlled." Dana's gaze flicked toward Rebecca, who refused to meet her eyes, staring instead at the table as if it could shield her from the truth. "The evidence is overwhelming," Dana continued, her voice rising with passion. "The body camera footage shows her brutality. The internal reports document her history. Sergeant Carter's words confirm her pattern. She acted without fear of consequence because, time and again, the system shielded her. But today, you have the power to change that. Tyrell Jenkins deserves justice. This community deserves accountability. And this courtroom deserves the truth only you can affirm with your verdict." She held their gaze a moment longer, then returned to her seat, her chin high, her resolve unshaken. Martin Graves stood next, his movements sluggish, as if the weight of his client's guilt dragged at his every step. He adjusted his tie nervously, his fingers fumbling, before approaching the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice softer than Dana's, lacking its fire. "This has been an emotional case, no question about it. The prosecution has laid out a compelling story, and I won't pretend the evidence doesn't sting. But please consider the bigger picture." He glanced at Rebecca, who sat motionless, her eyes fixed on her hands. "Officer Langley has given 8 years to this Joe years facing dangers and I can barely fathom. She's made split-second calls in chaos, decisions that aren't always perfect, but are made with the intent to keep us safe." His tone hardened slightly, though it carried a hollow ring. What happened that night wasn't malice, it was a mistake, a moment of weakness under pressure. "We've all stumbled. Should one night erase a career?" He returned to his seat, avoiding the jury's eyes, his words lingering like a plea that even he didn't fully believe. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, but to those in the courtroom, it felt like days. The air was thick with anticipation as they filed back in, their faces a mask of solemnity. The foreperson handed the verdict to the bailiff, who passed it to Cassandra. She unfolded the paper with steady hands, her expression unreadable as she scanned the words. As the jury reached a unanimous verdict, she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. Cassandra nodded. "In the case of Tyrell Jenkins versus Officer Rebecca Langley, on the charge of excessive force, how do you find the defendant?" "Guilty," the foreperson said, the word landing like a hammer. A ripple of gasps and murmurs swept through the gallery, but Cassandra silenced them with a single tap of her gavel. "And on the charge of falsifying reports, guilty," came the reply, unwavering. Rebecca's head fell into her hands, her shoulders trembling as the reality crashed over her. Martin rested a hand on her arm, but she didn't react, lost in the wreckage of her own making. Cassandra's gaze remained steady as she addressed the room. "Officer Rebecca Langley," she began, her voice firm yet measured, "this court finds you guilty on all charges. Your actions didn't just harm Tyrell Jenkins, they undermined the trust of every person who looks to the system for protection. You abused your power, and in doing so, you invited the consequences that follow." She paused, letting the silence underscore her words. "You are sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Furthermore, an independent committee will review every case tied to your conduct. Justice demands nothing less." The gavel fell one last time, its echo ringing through the emptying courtroom like a bell tolling the end of an era. As the room cleared, Rebecca sat alone at the defense table, the bustle of the courthouse continuing outside. The lesson was clear: power, when wielded without restraint, invites its own downfall. Justice had spoken, and for Rebecca Langley, there was no escape from its reach. In the dimly lit courtroom, a profound stillness settled over the space, heavy yet somehow reverent, as if the very walls held their breath in awe of what had just unfolded. The jury had deliberated for hours, their faces etched with the strain of their solemn duty, before finally delivering their decision. Judge Cassandra Blake, seated high behind her polished mahogany bench, had pronounced her verdict with a voice that carried both authority and an undercurrent of quiet resolve. For days, an oppressive fog of uncertainty had clung to the room, thick and suffocating, but now it dissipated, giving way to a serene sense of finality that felt almost tangible. Cassandra's fingers brushed lightly against the smooth wood of her desk, the rhythmic tapping a faint echo of the storm of thoughts swirling within her. The trial was over, its echoes fading into the stillness, yet she found herself unable to shake the enormity of what had just occurred. This wasn't merely a case closed. It was a reckoning, a piercing light cast upon the hidden fractures of a justice system, too often warped by unchecked power. Her dark eyes drifted to the case file resting before her, its pages worn from countless reviews. As she stared at it, her mind rewound to that pivotal moment, the first time she'd watched the grainy footage of Officer Rebecca Langley's encounter with Tyrell Jenkins. The video had been stark, unyielding in its clarity, Langley's voice sharp with arrogance, her hands forceful as she pinned Tyrell to the pavement, his pleas for mercy swallowed by the night air. That single piece of evidence had struck Cassandra like a thunderbolt, igniting a fire within her. It was the spark that had set this entire machinery of justice into motion, the undeniable proof that had unraveled Langley's weight of authority and led to her conviction. For Cassandra, it was more than a legal turning point, it was a personal one. She'd seen too many cases where power twisted the truth, where the scales of justice tilted under the weight of corruption. This time, she'd vowed, would be different. A soft knock at her chamber door jolted her from her reverie. "Come in," she called, her tone steady yet warm, carrying the quiet strength that had defined her tenure on the bench. The door creaked open, and Tyrell Jenkins stepped inside, his lanky frame hesitant yet upright, as though he were still testing the ground beneath him. Beside him stood his mother, Evelyn, a woman whose weathered face told stories of resilience forged through years of silent battles. They paused just inside the threshold, their eyes locking onto Cassandra with a mixture of awe and gratitude. Tyrell's shoulders, once slumped under the weight of despair, now carried a tentative pride. Evelyn's gaze, steady and piercing, softened as she offered Cassandra a small, heartfelt note, a gesture that spoke volumes without a single word. Tyrell broke the silence first, his voice rough with emotion, trembling as though each syllable cost him something dear. "Thank you, Your Honor. Never thought we'd make it this far. I never thought anybody would listen." His words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, a testament to the disbelief that still gnawed at him. He'd spent months replaying the incident in his mind, cold bite of the asphalt against his cheek, the sting of Langley's baton, the humiliation of being reduced to a target in his own neighborhood. To stand here now, in the presence of the woman who'd given him back his dignity, felt surreal, like a dream he feared he might wake from. Cassandra met his gaze with a gentle smile, her stern demeanor softening just enough to reveal the compassion beneath. "You're the one who deserves the thanks, Mr. Jenkins. You stood up when it mattered most. You made sure your story wasn't buried. All I did was ensure the system didn't fail you." Her words were deliberate, each one laced with a quiet conviction that resonated in the small room. She believed them deeply. Tyrell's courage had been the heartbeat of this case, pulsing through every testimony, every piece of evidence. Evelyn, who'd remained silent until now, stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if to steady herself. Her voice, when it came, was soft but thick with feeling, cracking under the weight of years of worry and hope. "What you did today, Judge Blake, what you did for my boy, it's everything to us. We'll carry this with us always. I've watched him suffer, watched him doubt himself, and you gave him a reason to hold his head up again." Tears glistened in her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. They were a badge of her pride, her pain, her triumph. She'd stood by Tyrell through every sleepless night, every whispered prayer, every moment when the world seemed stacked against them. To see justice served wasn't just a victory for her son, it was a vindication of her unwavering faith in him. Cassandra inclined her head, her chest tightening with the gravity of Evelyn's words. "I didn't do it for gratitude," she said softly, her voice steady despite the emotion tugging at her. "I did it because it was right, because no one should have to fight this hard for what's fair." The three of them stood there, enveloped in the stillness of the chamber, the air thick with the shared weight of their journey. Evelyn reached out, placing a hand on Tyrell's shoulder, her touch grounding him as his tired eyes flickered with a newfound resolve. He was exhausted, worn thin by the sleepless nights and the relentless scrutiny, but beneath that fatigue burned a quiet strength, a fire that had carried him through the darkest hours and now glowed brighter than ever. "Justice doesn't always come easy," Cassandra murmured, her voice low and reflective, as though she were speaking as much to herself as to them. "But it has a way of cutting through the noise, of finding its path, even when we've all but given up hope." Her words lingered, a quiet promise woven into the fabric of the moment. As Tyrell and Evelyn turned to leave, their footsteps soft against the hardwood floor, Cassandra watched them go, her heart heavy yet full. She turned back to her desk, her fingers tracing the edges of the case file once more. The trial had been a grueling marathon, a clash of wills, a test of endurance, but it had ended in triumph, not just for Tyrell, but for every soul the system had failed before him. The courtroom beyond her chambers had emptied out, its rows of benches now silent witnesses to the drama that had unfolded. Yet the echoes of the trial lingered in Cassandra's mind, the sharp cadence of the prosecutor's arguments, the hushed gasps of the gallery as the footage played, the steely defiance in Langley's eyes as the guilty verdict rang out. That woman officer, Rebecca Langley, had sat there day after day, her uniform crisp, her posture rigid, as if her badge could shield her from accountability. She'd been so certain of her impunity, her smirk barely concealed as witnesses recounted her brutality. But the truth had a way of stripping away such arrogance, and when the gavel fell, it wasn't just Langley who'd been judged, it was the system that had emboldened her. Cassandra's thoughts drifted to the broader implications. This case would ripple outward, a stone dropped into still water, its waves lapping against the foundations of a justice system too long plagued by bias and corruption. It wasn't just about one officer's misdeeds. It was about a culture that had allowed power to fester unchecked, a culture that had turned a blind eye to the cries of people like Tyrell. She knew the headlines would frame it as a spectacular, dramatic fall of a rogue cop, but to her, it was something deeper, a stand against abuse, a testament to the law's duty to protect all, not just the privileged few. Her phone buzzed on the desk, snapping her back to the present. She glanced at the screen, a text from a colleague down the hall. "Great work today, Cassandra. You've shifted something big." A faint smile tugged at her lips, pride swelling in her chest. The message was brief, but its meaning struck her like a chord. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. More cases loomed on the horizon, each with its own tangle of lies and half-truths, but every win, no matter how hard fought, was a step toward a world where justice wasn't a privilege but a right. As she gathered her things to leave, Cassandra paused at the door, casting a final glance out at the bustling courthouse below. Clerks darted between offices, lawyers huddled in corners, their voices a low hum against the clatter of footsteps. The world outside churned on, relentless and chaotic, but for her, time seemed to freeze, if only for a heartbeat. She thought of the countless cases she'd presided over, some mundane, others wrenching in their complexity, but none had gripped her like this one. This trial had been a crucible, a reminder that justice wasn't a cold machine of laws and rulings. It was a living, breathing force fueled by courage and conviction. Stepping into the sunlit hallway, her robe swaying lightly with each stride, Cassandra felt the weight of the case settle into her bones. It would stay with her, just as it would stay with Tyrell, Evelyn, and every onlooker who'd witnessed its unfolding. Justice had prevailed, not flawlessly, not without cost, but with a fierce clarity that cut through the murk of prejudice and power. Langley's downfall was a warning to those who wielded authority like a weapon. No one stood above the law, and as the echoes of this story faded into the clamor of the world beyond, its lesson endured. Accountability was non-negotiable, and the fight for what was right would press on, relentless and unbroken.